Hi, my name is David Ackerman, and here on Yiddishkeit, we talk about the experience of Jewishness. If you look at the videos that I've posted over the past 2 years or so, you'll see that the topics range from Jewish history, Jewish culture, and Jewish art, like movies. But the one thing that I haven't really talked about is me. Over the past 2 years, many of you have subscribed and honestly become a part of my journey. And so in this video, I want to honor that by telling you more about my story and to give you a better sense of the personal drive behind this channel. There's this Yiddish film from 1940 called Der Wilner Ballabessel, or its English title is Overture to Glory. It follows the story of a man named Yoel David Straczynski, who is the chazan, the cantor in the synagogue in Vilna. He then gets offered to learn classical music and an opportunity to perform in an opera in Warsaw. His father-in-law, who supports him, and the rabbi of the community disapprove of his venture outside the confines of the synagogue, and so Yoel David begins to learn classical music in secret. Eventually, with his wife's reluctant blessing, he heads off to Warsaw to participate in the opera world. Famously, he regrets his decision and returns to his town on the eve of Yom Kippur, just in time to recite Kol Nidre, which he takes over in the middle. But it is too late, and the consequences of his actions are fatal to him and those that he loves. This is considered to be one of the best Yiddish films ever made. But to me, it has a special meaning since, in many ways, this is my story. In this film, Yoel David is what I like to call a Beis Hakisei Boy, just like me. And so, in this video, I want to explain to you what that is. When I was growing up, the internet, which had just recently emerged, was strictly forbidden. And when smartphones came out in the 2010s, they too were also quickly prohibited by rabbinic authorities. A few years after the release of the iPhone, tens of thousands of Jews gathered into 2 stadiums in New York in order to effectively ban any personal use of the internet, whether on a smartphone or a computer, an event that would go on to shape my life.
I've seen with my own eyes people giving children of 11 years old Blackberries and iPhones and iPods. Are they out of their minds?
And so even though smartphones became the norm in the 2010s, in the world that I was growing up in, it was forbidden, toxic. You did not want to get caught with a phone in school or on the street, or in some cases in your home, because it wasn't just against the school rules. Having a smartphone would ruin your life. And so I am part of a generation of kids who grew up using their smartphone, or in my case, an iPod Touch, in secret. And there was no better place to hide that than in the bathroom. In modern Hebrew, the word for bathroom is shirotim. But growing up, when our rabbis would refer to the bathroom, they would use the term Beis Hakisei, which is more Talmudic. And so I am a Beis Hakisei boy. And so I, like Yoel David in that film, was hiding something that shouldn't be shameful. In his case, it was learning classical music, or in my case, watching movies and TV shows and texting my friends. And this not only became a giant secret at the center of my life, which came to define my teenage years, but it also came to define my experience within Orthodox Judaism. And so that's what I want to do with you, the viewer. I want to unpack all of this. I want to explain what it means to be a Beis Hakisei boy or girl, to contextualize it in terms of where I come from, and show you how it connects to what this channel is all about. To truly give you a sense of who I am, I need to start at the beginning. My family is of Ukrainian Jewish descent, and for hundreds of years they lived in little towns in the Ukrainian countryside called mistiechki, or as you probably know them by their Yiddish name, shtetls. You can get a sense of what this was like in the famous musical Fiddler on the Roof. But my favorite reference point for this is actually the movie Everything is Illuminated. This movie follows a young American man who makes a trip to Ukraine to learn more about his grandfather's story. And together with his local Ukrainian guides, he finds the remains of the old shtetl his grandfather came from. And so this movie resonates a lot more with my family's history and my own experience. However, as the industrial age dawned, Jews were able to move to big cities to look for new opportunities. and this brought my family to the city of Odessa on the Black Sea. This city had a thriving Jewish population in the 1800s, which my family was a part of, and has been captured in various works of Yiddish writing, including by Shalom Aleichem, the author of the original stories of Tevye the Milkman. The specifics of the city of Odessa have been immortalized by another Yiddish writer named Isaac Babel. In his collection of stories, he captures the underground world of Jewish gangsters of the time, which has recently been recreated in a show called Once Upon a Time in Odessa. And it's through these movies and shows that I connect with my roots in Ukraine. However, with the 20th century came chaos. In 1917, the Communist Revolution led to the end of the Russian monarchy and triggered the beginning of a civil war, which would see the beginning of the end for Jews in the Russian Empire, including Ukraine. In 1941, with the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was one of the first areas invaded. Both of my parents' families fled to Asia, to Uzbekistan, with many of my relatives fighting in the Soviet army against the Nazis. But after the war, my father's side returned to Ukraine, while my mother's side remained in Uzbekistan. My father's family moved to a city called Khmelnytsky, named after a Ukrainian national hero who liberated Ukraine and also happened to slaughter hundreds of thousands of Jews in the area 300 years prior. Now, atheism was the unofficial state religion of the Soviet Union, with any form of Jewishness being repressed. There's this book I once read that showed images of Soviet propaganda that discouraged religious belief of any kind. And this was because having an identity that was anything other than a member of the Communist Workers' Party who were working to usher in the end stages of history was seen as antithetical to the state itself. And although it was rarely spoken of, the threat of being disappeared into a Russian labor camp was ever present when considering the expression of Jewishness. Although famously there was a contingent of Jews who refused to repress their religious identity, known as the refuseniks, in reality they were a tiny, tiny minority. In reality, the overwhelming number of Soviet Jews did not openly express their Jewishness for several generations. As a result, by the time my parents were growing up in the 70s and 80s, all they knew about their Jewishness was that it was a secret. My father recalls hearing his parents speaking Yiddish growing up, but he wasn't allowed to speak it out of fear that it would arouse the suspicion of his classmates. And my mother, who grew up in the capital of Uzbekistan, Tashkent, remembers her father reading a Yiddish newspaper to keep up to date with news from Israel, but in effect, any public displays of Jewishness were essentially non-existent. As a result, the way Jewishness was expressed in my parents' families was in the food that they ate, and specifically in the time that they were eaten. For example, in April of each year, my great-aunt would place a cryptic phone call to my grandfather, and a few weeks later, my father would go across town to her house to pick up a package which was filled with matzah crackers, which of course were baked in secret and distributed like some sort of contraband. There's also zapikanka, which is a Russian-style cheesecake in May. There's jam-filled cookies in March, honey cake in September, and cooked fish loaf for special occasions. But with the thawing of the Cold War, there was a movement to bring these Soviet Jews back into the fold of Orthodoxy, known as the Kiruv movement. And as the families of both of my parents left their respective countries and came to America, both of my parents would end up getting involved in the Kiruv movement. While still living in Ukraine, my father would spend a summer in Israel in a Jewish institution called Aish HaTorah in Jerusalem. You can see the influence of this institution in a recent video from Nas Daily, where he did a series about different religions, and for Judaism, he visits Aish HaTorah. My mother would attend a similar institution in Brooklyn for high school called Ber Hagola, and in the late 1990s, they would meet in a synagogue for Soviet immigrants, get married, and go on to have my siblings and I. The thing is that in the Orthodox world, my parents and I had different status. They were labeled as BT, or Balei Tshuva, which means that they became Orthodox by choice, while my siblings and I were labeled FFB, which means from birth, which means that we became Orthodox by birth. Although I attended a mainstream Orthodox institution in Brooklyn known as Mir Yeshiva, I was keenly aware of the fact that I had a very different status than that of my peers because of my Russian Bali Tshuva parents. And I was also aware of the other children of Russian Bali Tshuva in my school as well as in my community, some of whom adapted well to the Orthodox world, and some of us who didn't. When it comes to me, I adjusted well on the outside. I learned the ropes of what it means to be yeshivish, but there was always a part of me that didn't truly fit in. And I always felt like something was missing. There was a certain idea of what it meant to be Jewish that seemed to be implicitly understood by all of my peers, but being the child of Russian Bali Tshuva, I just didn't have that. But this was something that I wouldn't address until later on, because first, I would face another challenge, the Beis Hakisei. I grew up in a really interesting time because I got to witness a technological shift. When I was a kid, tapes and CDs were everywhere. But by the time I graduated high school, everyone had a smartphone and the president was literally tweeting out memes. To the older generation who grew up without iPods, iPhones, and iPads, they rejected out of hand this idea that it was appropriate for teenagers to have these things. But what they failed to realize was that this technology was becoming so ubiquitous that rejecting it wasn't really a viable option. In the gathering in 2012, which we mentioned earlier, the rabbis pushed people to make a commitment to completely eschew the internet for any personal use. But what they didn't preempt was what would happen less than a decade later with the pandemic. I will never forget that day in March of 2020 when I was working as a teacher in another school that I went to as a student. When I went there as a student just a few short years earlier, the sentiment of the yeshiva was that the internet wasn't allowed. But now, because of the closures for the pandemic, these rabbis were calling up all the parents to ensure that their children had access to the internet. I felt like I was dreaming. What shook me was the fact that this phrase, "Does your son have access to the internet?" was once used to interrogate people to ensure that they don't have it, was now being used to ensure that people do have it so that their sons can attend classes online. And to me, this sudden shift had clarified something that I felt for years. It demonstrated how unviable that earlier strategy really was, and the reason why it shook me was because up until that point, this had been the central tension of my life. When I was in 8th grade, the iPhone 5 came out, and what this did was it made all the previous versions of the iPhone and iPod a lot cheaper and therefore a lot more accessible. Now, this is going to sound extremely cliche, but all of my friends had it. All of my friends had a device on which they would stream movies and music from the internet. The point is that I was constantly coming into contact with smartphones or other smart devices and the internet, and naturally, I wanted something for myself. At first, I decided to go the legal route and ask my parents if I could buy myself an iPod Touch using my own bar mitzvah money. But when my pleas fell on deaf ears, eventually I went the surreptitious route. And over the course of my years in high school, I would go on to borrow and own several devices. This secret that I owned an iPod Touch came to dominate my life as a student, since the threat of being discovered was constantly hanging over my head. Stories would start to circulate about how the principal would discover people in a pizza shop on the weekend and confiscate their phone. And sometimes if the principal found that they were talking to girls on their device, well, then they would be kicked out of school. And one such story actually hit really close to home because a close friend of mine in 9th grade got his phone taken away just a few weeks into high school, and this put all of us who were in his contacts, myself included, on very thin ice with the principal. This idea of having your device confiscated by the teacher or the principal reminds me of this moment from a movie called A Serious Man, where Danny gets his radio taken away by his Hebrew teacher.
Moshe.
And Danny also needs to go to the principal in order to discuss the fact that he has this device. But in that movie, the problem wasn't that he owned a device to begin with. That was okay. It was the fact that he was using it in middle of class. But the reason why this scene resonates with me so much is because it reflects the fear that I had in yeshiva. When I was a student, we also pulled similar shtick of listening to music during school in middle of class. Although by the time it came to our generation, we updated our technology. For example, for a couple of years in high school, I had this hoodie where the drawstrings actually had little earbuds on the end of it, and there was an aux cable in one of the pockets where you can connect an iPod or an MP3 player. And so despite the threat of being discovered for listening to music in the middle of class, or the bigger sin of just owning a smart device in general, this did nothing to stop those of us who were plugged into the internet. For 9th and 10th grades, I attended the same school I went to for elementary, called Mir Yeshiva, where I befriended the custodian, a man named Edgar. He was the man. He had a closet in the high school where he would keep his supplies, but he also let us charge our phones there, and on a rare occasion to use our phones there as well. Edgar was our man on the inside. But usually if you wanted to use your phone or iPod Touch during school hours, you would do it in one of the bathroom stalls in the high school or around the school campus. For most of us back then, we didn't have the money to pay for a phone plan, which would give us internet, and so we constantly relied on Wi-Fi. And in middle of 10th grade, one of the students figured out what the password was to the school Wi-Fi, which only teachers were allowed to use. I don't think I can truly convey to you what it felt like to use the school Wi-Fi to stream the TV show Arrow on my iPod Touch in the school bathroom. Those were the days. We felt invincible. We felt like the biggest gangsters of all time. Or in other words, we were the Beis Hakisei Boys. However, all of this would come crashing down. Eventually, my parents discovered that I had an iPod Touch in secret. Besides their disappointment that I went behind their back, the real struggle session would occur with the rabbis. Our rabbis seemed to have this sixth sense for us Beis Hakisei boys, and they would all have these different strategies to get us to conform to the rules. One strategy was to be super antagonistic from the get-go. This was the principal's approach. Others toned down their lectures a little bit in hopes of getting through to us. And there was a third breed that would pop up in all Orthodox institutions I attended, which can only be described as emotional predators. These were the type of people that would use any information you gave them against you, even when it was super vulnerable, in order to force compliance with God's will. By the time 10th grade ended, a third of my grade had left that school, myself included. We were not welcomed back for another year at that school since we didn't meet the standards. In some cases, the parents were able to find a deal with the school to allow their sons to stay for another year or two. But in my case, being the child of Russian Baalei Teshuvas, they didn't have any leverage with the school, and so they went along with the recommendation to send me to a smaller school that would be better suited for a Beis Hakisei boy like me. With that came the end of an era which, ironically enough, began with Kiruv, which the word literally means to bring close, and the movement was about bringing people closer to their Jewishness. But instead, what I learned from my experience in Yeshiva was that I'll always be an outsider because of my Russian background and my Baal Tshuva parents and my disregard for the rules as a Beis Hakisei boy. But to be honest with you, I really hoped that this new chapter, which was forced upon me, would end up being an opportunity for me to right the ship. I hoped that I would be able to leave the Beis Hakisei boy behind me and become a Ben Torah, a nice Jewish boy. As middle school ended and I entered the high school years, I began to feel myself being pulled between two worlds. In the day-to-day, I felt the pressure to be the best version of myself, to wear the white shirt and the hat and jacket, down to the type of shoes that I wore and what I did with my day. However, my parents' families are not religious since they didn't go through the Kiruv movement, and so their children, my cousins, went to public school. And so I was always aware that my knowledge of secular things like the internet or television could get me into trouble. There's this moment that I still remember from when I was around 8 years old where my classmates were arguing about what is the biggest number. So one kid says, it's 1,000,000. Another one says, no, it's 1,000,000,000. A third kid goes, no, you're both wrong, it's a Google. But because of my exposure to the internet, I chimed into the conversation and say, no, the biggest number is actually a Gmail. And as soon as these words left my mouth, I felt a sense of panic take over my body because I knew that if anyone truly understood what I just said, then this might spell the end of my attendance in this school. And so the older I got, the more I felt the pull between these two worlds of conformity to the Orthodox world on one side and awareness of and partaking in secular entertainment on the other. There was some attention given to this issue by my rabbis in middle school, but this issue came to a head in high school, especially when the high school I was attending asked me to find a different school, one that would be better suited to someone living between two worlds. It's this idea of duality that I want to focus on here. It's something that I was aware of from a very young age, but the way that I would approach this idea would eventually change and would go on to shape me as a person. In Judaism, there's this idea of the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov, or the good and bad inclinations or spirits that are always at odds with each other. And in fact, the battle between them is constantly playing out inside each and every one of us. There's one story from the Torah that really stuck with me because it helps illustrate this idea of opposite spirits battling out inside of a person. It's about Rivka, or Rebecca, when she was pregnant with her two sons, the twins, Yaakov and Esav, or Jacob and Esau. Tradition tells us that when she was pregnant with the twins and she would pass a holy place, that Yaakov would start to kick. And when she would pass a place of lewdness or idol worship, that Esav would start to kick. Oddly enough, as a child, I really related to this story because in many ways I felt like I too had Yaakov and Esav inside of me. However, over the course of my time in Yeshiva, I learned that only Yaakov was allowed to be expressed while Esav needed to remain hidden. But like Rivka, I felt Esav kicking inside of me too. And so I'm going to use this story as a way to help frame all of the uncomfortable feelings that I had, the ugly truth that I had exposure to the outside world, and worst of all, that I had curiosity. Back in Yeshiva, I would refer to this side of my existence as Esav, but now I'm going to call it the Beis Hakisei Boy. But there's one key difference between these two characters, and that is, in the story, Esav actually kills and violates people, while my sin was wanting to watch movies, go to a mixed gym, and use slang from the 2010s, like lit and bruh. But despite that minor detail, I began to truly feel the pull between two worlds, between good and bad, right and wrong, Yaakov and Esav, a Ben Torah and a Beis Hakisei Boy. I began to notice this motif in many stories that I heard growing up, as we mentioned the story of Yaakov and Esav, but also in this Soviet film, which my parents showed me when I was growing up, called Korolevstvo Krivych Zerkal, or the Kingdom of Crooked Mirrors, where this girl, Oля, steps through the mirror into this opposite world where she meets her reflection, Yalo.
Меня зовут Ело, а тебя Оля. Правильно. А как ты догадалась? Это очень просто. Ведь если я твое отражение, значит и имя у меня такое же, только наоборот. Интересно. Ело это значит Оля наоборот. Да.
And so this image of two versions of the same girl who are the inverse of each other resonated very deeply with the theme of the twin brothers of Yaakov and Esav. Out of all the Soviet movies that I watched growing up, and there was a lot of them, this one seemed to have made the deepest impact on me. It found its way into much of the writing that I did as a child, whether it was assignments for class or stories that I would write in my head and sometimes on paper. And so I want to take a few moments and share one of those stories with you now, because I think you'll see how it gives us a very deep insight into the state of my mind in the summer before 10th grade. The story is about a boy named David who's in 9th grade. I know, you're shocked. On the one hand, he wants to do the right thing. He wants to fit in with his peers and to make his parents and rabbis proud. On the other hand, he has a desire for normal teenage things like autonomy, to watch secular entertainment, and probably most scandalous of all, he's curious about girls. The story opens with David going through the motions of his yeshiva, but he's really struggling to keep up. His rabbis begin to notice this and start pointing out all the things he could be doing better in an effort to motivate him, but in reality, this just makes his struggle to exist even more intense. So one day, in a fit of desperation, while he's in the sanctuary during afternoon prayers, David prays to God. He says, please take away these desires for these mundane and impure things like movies and girls. And as he finishes this prayer, a clock falls off the wall, which he was standing under, and hits him on the head. Don't be too harsh on the narrative devices I came up with at 14 years old, but this point is going to be important later. And so later that day, as he's walking home, he's distracted and he doesn't notice that he walks into oncoming traffic and gets hit by a car. And then the next thing we know is that David wakes up in a hospital, and when the nurses notice that, they run to fetch the doctor and they inform him that he's actually been in a coma for a few weeks after he's been struck by that car. But instead of seeing his parents, he's visited by a social worker from the city who refers to him as David. At first, he's confused why his parents aren't there with him, but he soon learns that nobody knows who his family is. They all seem to assume that he just dropped out of nowhere. So he decides to bring up his family, and he's informed that there is another boy who was also struck by that car with that last name, but since he was behind David, he ended up not being hit as hard and went home just a few days later with a couple of bruises. And since that boy is someone else and no one knows who David's family is, he ends up getting put into the foster care system. And so one day, David decides to wait outside of his old home where he sees David come home. And at first, David has no idea who David is, but after a brief conversation, David manages to convince David that they're in fact the same person and that they were separated during the car accident. Nonetheless, David wants nothing to do with David and tells him to leave and go back to where he came from. David, not giving up that easily, decides to go back to his old yeshiva where he attended before the accident. And when the principal realizes that David knows, Gemara and Halacha and is familiar with the yeshiva system, he decides to not only accept him into the school, but out of the kindness of his heart to also adopt David as his foster child. Okay, bear with me because this is the juicy part of the story. David gets put into the same class as David, but no one in the school, not the teachers, not the students, knows who David is, and they all assume that he's a new student. The only ones that know about the fact that they're the same person and that they've been separated during this car accident are David and David. And what's strange is that during recess, David doesn't go back to his old friends, but rather starts talking about the Talmud with the more scholarly students, while David ends up making friends with his old friends from before the accident who don't recognize him at all. David asks his old friends about David, and they explain to him that after the accident, everything changed and they no longer spoke. So to pause for 1 second, we can see in the story how the two parts of the original character have now been severed into two, into the good guy and bad guy, into Yaakov and Esav. But David, being the good guy, is only interested in studying Torah and Talmud and prayer, while David goes back to his old ways of watching movies on his iPod Touch in the school bathroom and hanging out in a park after dark with other disaffected yeshiva boys and girls. At first, when the principal of the school finds out that David, the boy that he put up in his own home, is breaking his rules, he issues him several strict warnings. But after a while, these warnings turn into threats that if he keeps this up, not only is he going to be kicked out of the yeshiva, but he's going to be kicked out of his home and put back into the foster care system. And as the conflict comes to a head between David and the principal, we learn that it was actually David who was informing the principal of what David was doing, which is what was getting him into trouble. It's this betrayal that leads David to try to find a way to go back in time, to try to mend the two personas that were severed during the accident. So in the story, I ended up having this whole science fiction thing about how David figures out a way to go back in time. The whole thing hinges on the fact that since the clock fell on David during that prayer, it somehow opened up a second timeline, which allowed the two of them to get severed. Like I said, don't judge the narrative devices from when I was 14. I told you the clock thing was going to be important. The point is that David figures out a way to go back in time and mend the two personas back together. The thing is that if David does go back in time, then all of the friends that he made in this timeline are going to forget about him, including a girl who he met in the park, who at this point in the story has developed into his love interest. And she's very upset about this whole thing, that he has to go back in time and make her forget about him, because she doesn't see why he has to take such a drastic measure. But David explains to her that he does need to go back in time, since although he does love her, there's this part of himself that's missing that he needs to reunite with. However, he promises her that when he goes back in time, he's going to seek her out in the original timeline, since out of the two of them, he's going to be the only one who remembers. And so he does the whole science fiction thingy and goes back in time, and next thing we know, we see him wake up in his parents' home on the morning of the accident. The point of the story is that David realizes that the two personas, the good guy who wants to do everything right, and the rebel who stretches the rules, David and David, were both him. And so whatever he was going to have to face in the future, he was going to face with both parts of himself together. There's also an epilogue 10 years later where we see David on a date with the girl from the second timeline, and although we don't hear what they're saying, we can see how he fulfilled his promise to her. To be honest with you, I actually forgot that I wrote this story, and as I was writing this essay about my experience as a Beis Hakisei boy, I remembered that I wrote this, and suddenly it all started flooding back. I realized that this story is a profound look into the state of mind that I had back then, and so I recounted this story here because by analyzing the elements in the story, we can get a very deep insight into the psychology of the Beis Hakisei boy. There's this famous idea in psychology, which you probably heard of, called the unconscious, which is the idea that there's a part of our mind that controls what we do day to day, which we don't really have access to under normal circumstances. The psychoanalyst Carl Jung talked about this part of the unconscious where we hide all the things about ourselves which don't fit neatly into society, all the ugly truths, which he called the shadow. And what he describes is that most people tend to disown their shadow, to pretend like those parts of themselves don't even exist. The problem with disowning the shadow is that a person stops seeing the full picture of who they are and starts to see all of their flaws in other people, which is called projection, and it also leads to self-destructive behaviors. In the story that I wrote as a 9th grader, David is the exterior persona, while David is his shadow. And David refuses to acknowledge him or to be friends with him, and in the end ends up betraying him just to be accepted by others. The solution that Jung describes is called integration, which is bringing awareness and acceptance of the shadow. And it's by accepting these hidden parts that a person can find wholeness, which Jung called individuation. And we can see this in the story too, where David realizes that he can't go on living as an isolated shadow, but rather he must be integrated with the other parts of him in order to live a fulfilled life. Now, I'll be honest, I did not know about Carl Jung when I was in 9th grade, but clearly I was going through some Jungian shit, which expressed itself in the motif of the twin personas. It was after high school that I became interested in psychology and philosophy that I first learned about Carl Jung, as well as another author named Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He wrote about the Russian labor camp system called the Gulag, and in that book he has this passage which resonates deeply with this theme of integration, which had a deep impact on my life. And so I want to read you this small passage. If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere, insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? During the life of any heart, this line keeps changing place. Sometimes it is squeezed one way by exuberant evil, and sometimes it shifts to allow enough space for good to flourish. One and the same human being is, at various ages, under various circumstances, a totally different human being. At times, he is close to being a devil, at times to sainthood. But his name doesn't change. And to that name, we ascribe the whole lot, good and evil. As Socrates taught us, know thyself. To this day, when I read this passage, I get emotional. I love this line of know thyself. Know that you are both good and evil. Yaakov and Esav, David and David, a Yeshiva bacher and a Beis Hakisei boy. Internalizing this idea changed my life. Realizing that I am a fusion of the two, an integration. I am both. Over the past few years, I've been reading and watching many Jewish stories, and I've come to realize that this theme of being pulled between two worlds is ever present. For example, in the Yiddish movie we started with, Overture to Glory, Yol David is also pulled between two worlds, one of being a cantor in the synagogue and the other being a musician in the opera. In fact, there's a moment in that movie where the rabbi says this idea very explicitly.
Wenn sie sind gekommen zu uns, die Herren, einen mir der Leben, bis die übergehen zu sehen, bis die stehen bleiben zwischen beide Welten, wie nirgends zu sehen. Denke es,
But in addition to this idea of being pulled between two worlds, it comes with this secondary idea of the feeling of constantly being watched. In Overture to Glory, Yol David's father-in-law doesn't want him learning secular music, and so he sends his attendant to spy on Yol David. There's this one scene in the film which is permanently etched on my mind, where Yol David is in the home of the Gentile music teacher, and the father-in-law's attendant is staring at him through the window with these big bug eyes. And then the attendant reports back to the father-in-law, which causes this conflict to resurface. And so this element of constantly being watched goes hand in hand with this idea of living between two worlds, and this was also something that was present when I was growing up. There's a reason why growing up we had to use our iPod Touch or smartphones in the bathroom, and that is because everyone was constantly watching each other, and if they saw something that was untoward, they would report it to the principal. And so in my mind, the rabbis in my life had evolved from spiritual guides to Big Brother in George Orwell's 1984. Another example of this is from a recent movie called Disobedience, which is about a woman named Esty who is lesbian but married to a rabbi, and so she has no choice but to repress this part of her. But when her former lover returns to her hometown after the death of a relative, the two of them reunite, and there's this moment where they kiss in a park, and there's members of the community who end up seeing them. And there's a scene a little later on where Esty is called into her boss's office at her job, where these community members who caught her kissing a woman are present in the office. Although we don't hear what that conversation is, the implication is very, very clear, and that is that Esty, being a Beis Hakisei girl, let that part of herself out for just a moment, put her job, as well as her husband's position in the community, into jeopardy. But probably the most famous example of a Beis Hakisei boy is Danny Saunders from the novel The Chosen, written by Chaim Potok. In the story, Danny is someone who feels forced to keep up appearances as someone who is slated to take over his father as the rabbi of the community, despite the fact that his real dream is to pursue a career in psychology. There's this moment where Danny shares this secret that he's hiding with his friend Ruvain, and I don't think that it's a coincidence that it comes up in context of a conversation about the unconscious mind.
Deep inside of us, there's something. It's called the unconscious. It makes us do and feel things without us ever even being aware of it. It's filled with things that we're afraid to tell ourselves.
Danny, where did you learn all this stuff?
I've been reading about it.
In Hebrew class?
No. In the library.
It's okay with me.
With you, maybe. My father, he's very specific about the things we're allowed to read. I met this man in the library. He's been showing me books to read. Fitzgerald, Steinbeck, Hemingway. Now I'm concentrating on psychology. Adler, Jung, Freud. It's incredible, Reuben. It's exciting. I've been going to the library as often as I can without anyone finding out about it.
I'll keep your secret.
Like Yol David and his love of music, or Esty and her sexuality, or myself and the iPod Touch, Danny is also a Beis Hakisei boy, except that he hides in the library instead of the bathroom. And we can hear the fear in Danny's words, this feeling that he's constantly being watched and how that affects the way that he moves through the world. And like every story about a Beis Hakisei boy or girl, eventually the secret comes out.
I understand that My Daniel spends several hours a day at the library. Noah had to find out about this. The neighborhood's too small that I shouldn't find out about it.
He knows all about the library.
Being a Beis Hakisei boy or girl is more than just hiding a secret and being paranoid about the fact that it might be discovered. It's a persona. It's a way of existing where you're expected to disown an entire part of yourself for the sake of the greater good, namely religion. In my case, my secret was that I had an iPod Touch in high school that had TV shows and movies on it, but the persona that developed as a result of that was one that didn't trust anyone and was constantly hiding in fear. When that secret did emerge, the fact that in addition to Yaakov, I also had an Esav inside of me that refused to simply disappear, I, along with a third of my grade, was asked to leave the school. In the 1800s, there was this rabbi named Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, but he's better known by his initials as the Netziv. Towards the end of his life, he published a book called Emek She'ela, and at an event to celebrate this publication, he told the following story. As a young child, he had a hard time being attentive in Hebrew school, and one night he overheard his parents talking about his failures as a Talmudic student and that they were ready to send him off to apprentice as a shoemaker. And upon hearing this, the Netziv recalls, he began to turn his life around and to take his studies more seriously. And eventually, he gained a lot of knowledge and wisdom and ended up becoming one of the biggest rabbis of his day. But the story doesn't end there. At this gathering, the Netziv reflects on the fact that what if he hadn't heard his parents talking about the fact that they were ready to send him off to be a shoemaker? He wouldn't have become a big rabbi, and he wouldn't have authored any of his works. And so he imagines himself coming up to heaven after his death, and God asking him from the heavenly court, "Where's all your works? Where's the Emek She'ela?" In this alternate reality, the shoemaker would be really confused. He would say, "What books? What are you talking about? I'm just a shoemaker." However, we know, explains the Netziv, that he was destined to write these books. He had the potential. The point of this story is that in those moments where we feel that flash of inspiration, the call of destiny, to seize that opportunity. And that each and every one of us also has this Netziv moment where we're able to take an opportunity and change the course of our lives. Now, this story was repeated a lot when I was growing up, since the Netziv is one of the biggest names in the Orthodox Hall of Fame. And so as I look back at my own experience of transitioning between Mir and the new school, I couldn't help but feel that I too had a similar opportunity. I truly hope that this was my own Netziv moment, a time when I would be able to grow spiritually and achieve my potential. However, what I experienced in this second school, which is known as Zucker's, was very, very different. In this school, they acted like they were much more open to the idea of watching movies and listening to pop music and following sports and so on. But the truth is that they weren't. And this duplicity made it a lot worse. In Mir, they were very clear. We don't like the Beis Hakisei Boy. We don't like that part of you, and so keep it hidden in the bathroom, so to speak. But in Zucker's, they acted like, no, we totally accept that part of you. But what I later learned was that it was only a ploy to draw that part out, only then to apply the same mentality as Mir. And since this repression occurred when my guard was down, when I was in a much more vulnerable state, the effects were much more devastating on my psyche. I will never ever forget the experience of sharing with my 11th grade rabbi that I felt pulled between two parts of myself, one which wanted to conform to the Orthodox world and the other which didn't feel any of it. I really wanted to take advantage of this moment, just like the Netziv did, but I also didn't know what to do with this whole other part of me, which we call the Beis Hakisei Boy. The response that I got was, yes, you will have to hide that part of you forever. It will never be good enough. It will never be acceptable. He said that the same way that gay people have to hide their identity, this desire which doesn't fit into the Orthodox world, that so too anyone, including me, who had complicated feelings about life or religion, must keep that part of themselves hidden. In short, his advice was, if you want to be successful in the Orthodox world, then you need to keep that part of you hidden in the Beis Hakisei and pretend that it doesn't exist. I'll never forget that feeling that I had when I heard this. It wasn't just this like logical moment where I'm like, oh, that's an interesting point, I don't agree. Instead, what I felt was visceral. My vision went blurry. I felt like I swallowed poison, like I touched a live wire, like someone just punched me in the chest. To me, that moment was way bigger than just bad advice from a teacher. It was my Netziv moment. It was where I was being vulnerable for the sake of pursuing something greater, but it didn't turn out the way I hoped it would. What I needed to hear in that moment was that this feeling is actually really, really normal. There's a reason why the story of Yaakov and Esav, this duality, has been passed down for so many generations, because this is a story that applies to everyone, to all of humanity. But instead what I got was the idea that since I would never truly be able to rid myself of the Beis Hakisei Boy, and that it was always going to be a part of me, I would never be able to achieve what the Netziv was able to achieve. And that's why I felt so sick. Even though I couldn't articulate it in the moment, what I felt was that there truly was no path forward. And so the logical conclusion of that is, why try at all? And as you can imagine, this sent me into a massive, massive spiral. That summer, I watched a show called Dexter, which is about this serial killer who works for the Miami Police Department, and he refers to his urges to kill people as his dark passenger, which is clearly a reference to the Jungian idea of the shadow. And so during that phase, I really identified with Dexter. I felt that just like he had this big secret, that he was a homicidal psychopath, since I also had a secret that I like to watch movies and TV shows, that we were essentially the same. Now, as I'm saying this, I'm realizing how absolutely crazy this is, but that's the truth. That's really how I felt. And so my entire 12th grade was consumed by this thought, this idea that I would only ever truly achieve my potential if I disowned a part of myself. Now fast forward to a couple of years ago when I was listening to this interview with a woman named Rebbetzin Leah Trink, who is the widow of a rabbi named David Trink. And in the interview, she reflects on who her husband was before he passed, and on the fact that he had extremely warm relationships with his students.
Certain things we just have to ignore. My husband was the model of it, of not focusing on what people did wrong and seeing how good they are. Not looking to condemn anybody, anyone.
It's almost like he didn't see the external. He only saw directly straight into the core of his Talmidim. Like a modern day Reb Levi Yitzchak Mibarditchev, like only seeing the beauty, only seeing the positive.
There was one moment which really touched my soul, and honestly, it made me really, really sad. She describes how at the end of Rabbi Trank's life, many people would come visit him in his home and reflect together on the times that they had.
There is one person who is a Rosh Yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael who was my husband's Talmud in 9th grade. He came a few times to see my husband when my husband was sick, and he just cried on my couch, and all he could say is, Rebbe, what would have become of me if not for you? What would have become of me?
When I first heard this, I couldn't help but compare myself to that person and my rabbi to Rabbi Trank. They couldn't be more different. What's interesting is that Rabbi Trank was a 9th grade Rebbe, which to most people I know is not a super influential role. But it was the fact that Rabbi Trank saw that person as more than just a Beis Hakisei boy. And instead of demanding repression, he ended up seeing their true potential, which is something that stayed with that person for the rest of their life. And honestly, it's kind of funny and kind of sad how Rabbi Trank's idea, which has become sloganized into the words, just love them, is considered a revolutionary concept in the Orthodox world. Wait, what? So what you're telling me is that My child, who is struggling with different parts of themselves between insularity versus pop culture, which, by the way, every single human since the dawn of humanity has been dealing with, they still deserve love? Wow, this is truly a groundbreaking idea. What this interview made me realize is that what I experienced wasn't just a non-Netziv moment. It was actually the inverse of what this man experienced. Where he felt understood, I felt betrayed. Where he felt his potential, I felt a profound confusion. Where he felt supported, I felt alienated from my own self. Where this student of Rabbi Trank had the ability to integrate his challenges as part of his persona, I felt presented with a binary choice, either a Ben Torah or a Beis Hakisei Boy, on the derech or off the derech, Yaakov or Esav. And so, after hearing this interview, I began to refer to the conversation I had with my 11th grade rabbi as my anti-Netziv moment. Although that experience was extremely painful, and frankly, it robbed me of my experience of my senior year of high school, it started a journey where I wanted to seek out a vision which was bigger than the one that my 11th grade rabbi offered me, and it leads all the way to the person who is speaking to you right now in this moment. It was a journey where I not only reconnected with myself and my sense of Jewishness, but with my purpose in life. To explain that last point, I need to start with a bowl of grapes. I have always loved movies. Growing up, my parents showed me a lot of Soviet films, one of which I mentioned, and they also showed me Jewish films that were popular in the early 2000s when I was growing up. And as I got a little older, I also saw some American movies like The Lion King and American Tail. But everything changed one day when I was around 8 years old, when I first learned about this program called Windows Movie Maker, which allowed you to make videos. I realized that I no longer have to just be a viewer of videos, but I can also be a video creator. At first, I would just make slideshows for family events or silly home videos, but my video creation would level up one day in 7th grade. One Friday, we were learning about this idea of Bikurim, Truma, and Meiser, which, in case you don't know, are these ideas of tithes and other portions that a farmer would have to give to priests and Levites and other people during biblical times. Our rabbi told us to review all of this information since we would be having a quiz on it first thing Sunday. So after class, I went over to the rabbi and asked him how he would recommend studying for this quiz, since all of this information seemed very abstract to me. A few weeks earlier, there was a parent orientation night, and my father had mentioned to that rabbi that I had been experimenting with video creation. And so in response to my question, the rabbi said, "Why don't you just make a video about it?" To this day, I have no idea if he was just saying like a throwaway line or whether he actually saw something in me. But either way, I decided to take him seriously. I knew that I didn't want to just stand in front of the camera and talk about biblical tithes, because not only is that extremely boring, but it wouldn't actually help me remember any of that information. Instead, as I walked home, I created several characters to whom all of these laws would actually be relevant. There was, of course, the farmer, whose produce, the grapes, were in question. There was also the wise old priest, the Kohen. There was the super devout Levite, as well as the shy pauper, all of whom receive a portion of the fruits. And so when I came home, I informed my family about what I was about to do, and with the help of my sister, who recorded these sketches, I made my very first informational video.
Today we're going to be discussing some of the things that we give away to the Kahanim or Levim.
And so that Sunday, I walked into class and handed my rabbi a USB and said, "Here, I did what you said. I made a video." At first, the rabbi was in disbelief, but he promised that he would watch the video, and if he approved, he would show it to the class before we take the quiz. It's hard to describe that feeling that I had watching my classmates watch me on the screen. If I had to describe it, it was a mix between feeling really shy and super exhilarated. But that Sunday morning, something began. I realized that this is what I want to do with my life. I want to take complex information and present it in a way which was accessible to other people. And so over the next few years in middle school and high school, I began to lean into this part of me, from creating comic strips about Talmudic discussions to charts that helped simplify Talmudic concepts, and of course, many more educational videos. Eventually, with the help of my classmates, we also leaned into the zeitgeist of the 2010s, which was taking pop songs and turning them into parodies for Jewish holidays. I actually did a whole separate video on just this part of my life about a year ago, which you can go check out after this video. And when I transferred over to the new school, I continued making these videos for a time. And although at first my new classmates were kind of confused about what the heck I was doing, I think eventually they just kind of accepted this as a part of who I was. Although these projects towed the line of what was acceptable in the Orthodox world, since at the end of the day, I was singing non-Jewish melodies, this served as an outlet for me to express my connection to Jewishness in my own unique way. However, after my Anti-Netziv Moment, I stopped making these type of videos, really stopped being creative at all, since because of that experience, I felt so alienated from the world and from myself that I just stopped doing the things that I loved. This depressive state honestly continued after high school as well, but there were some exceptions, particularly around the holiday of Purim, which is a slightly more jolly occasion, and so there's a little bit more room for creativity. Many schools put on a performance which kind of makes fun of the day-to-day experience in the yeshiva, usually in the form of a video. When I went to rabbinic seminary for a few years after high school, I helped create these films called Purim Spiels together with my peers. But the truth is that I didn't just want to make people laugh. I wanted to use my skills to be able to convey information. I wanted to use writing and visuals and combine them into videos to help take complex topics and make them feel accessible. About 2 years after graduating high school, I received an email from the alumni mailing list, which said that if you or anyone you know is interested in being a teacher, then please reach out to the school because they're looking for someone. Now, at this point, I did not have any official experience being a teacher, but I did have some experience being a substitute when I was in high school, as well as working in summer camps. And of course, there was my dormant love of conveying information. And so this prompted me to follow up with the principal of my school, who knew me when I was a student there. To be honest, I did not expect him to take me seriously, but I guess they were desperate enough. And so next thing you know, I was hired to be a teacher without any formal training or experience. The first few months of teaching were very tumultuous, to say the least. And frankly, I didn't really know what I was doing. I mean, I understood the material I was trying to teach, but I was trying to find clever ways to present it, and the truth is, it just wasn't it. But then in March of that year, everything changed. This was the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, and our school went online. I mentioned this moment earlier where it concerned the flip-flop regarding the issue of the internet, where just a few days earlier, the internet was something that needed to remain hidden, and now all of a sudden, due to extenuating circumstances, it not only was allowed, but necessary. And so the principal of the school calls me up and says that he was going to give me free range to decide how I was going to take my classes online. I always felt that I wanted to present ideas in videos and put it on YouTube, and so this felt like the perfect excuse to start. This first video that I made for the pandemic is truly a reflection of the first educational video ever made, almost a decade before that in 7th grade. In this video, I try to joke about the absurdity of the situation that we were all in during lockdown, and then pivot to try to give information about science.
All right, guys, let's settle down, please. Wait a second. Something's off. None of you are here. Okay, this is weird. We're just gonna pretend like this isn't happening. You're not in your living room, I'm not in your screen, and let's just jump into it. Earth science. We're going to talk about pages 2 and 3. We're going to talk about, the New York State maps, and then we're going to talk about pages 8 and 9, which is about the geological timescales. And then we're very important to know about the Cambrian, Ordovician, and Silurian, and everything with the dinosaurs and the trilobites and the Europeans. All right.
However, the more sustainable version of my YouTube videos during this time were these colorful slideshows about scientific topics that I would record and put on YouTube. However, after a few months, we returned to in-person classes, and I realized that the colorful presentations I was making were actually the things I was showing in class. And so when it came to videos, I wanted to go a level deeper. I wanted to understand and convey to my students the stories behind the information we were learning. Meaning, how did the scientists even figure out the information which we were studying in class? It all began with a book called The Story of Earth in 25 Rocks by Donald Prothero, which, not to sound dramatic, changed my life. It not only inspired my love of geology, but it also taught me how to tell a very complicated and technical story while still keeping it very interesting and exciting. Now, these type of books are found in the science reference section of your local bookstore, and so very soon I was adapting sections of science reference books into video essays, which I would periodically show to my students. I also discovered one of my biggest role models of the time, a man named Jim Al-Khalili, who is a British physics professor who has created some of the most incredible science documentaries I've ever seen. He covers topics from chemistry to electricity to nuclear physics and information theory, just to name a few. And this directly inspired me and the videos that I would make, and it led to also creating a film club, which was the precursor to the Shekino Club, where I covered scientific movies. I also created a documentary, which is about the geology of New York City, called To Shape a City, which I filmed with my friend Mayor, and happens to be this video along with the other ones I mentioned are all available on my older channel, which are linked below, so if you're interested, you can go check it out. At the time, this film about New York City's geology was not only the longest film I ever made, running at 24 minutes long, but also the most complex thing I ever wrote because it covered so many different topics and areas in New York. Despite the satisfaction of making these essays that covered in-depth topics about science, I felt that there was something gnawing at me in the background. And one day, about 3 years into teaching, I was laying in bed when it finally hit me. I missed studying Talmud. There was something about Talmud that went beyond just conveying information. It wasn't just about studying laws, but rather I was learning about my own heritage. In a way, I was learning about myself. The truth is, by this point, I had completely moved away from the person I was in Yeshiva and no longer consider myself Orthodox, since in my experience, being Orthodox was extremely superficial. It wasn't only that in Orthodoxy, there's a lot of emphasis on the externalities, the right books, the right food, the right clothing, the right ritual items, the right schools. But if there was any doubt, any feeling that didn't fit perfectly into the Orthodox world, then as my 11th grade rabbi had seared into my soul, they needed to be hidden in the Beis Hakisei. Although I started to miss actively engaging with my Jewishness, I also didn't really want to study Talmud. And so I needed a middle ground. A short while later that autumn, my friend Rafi and I were having a conversation about the upcoming holiday of Sukkot, which is celebrated by taking the 4 species, which are these 3 branches called a lulav, and this fruit, a citron called an esrog. But what's unique about this holiday is that for about a week before, these products are sold on the streets of Jewish neighborhoods in little pop-up markets. And all the men come out into the street to look for these products and inspect their quality, especially the esrog. And so Rafi quipped that imagine if an alien were to land into the streets of a Jewish neighborhood a week before Sukkot, they would be extremely confused to see all of these men staring at what looks like lemons and not even eating them. And this comment deeply intrigued me because I knew the reason for this practice because I grew up Orthodox, but it also presented an opportunity for me to explain this very esoteric ritual in a simplistic way that even this alien who just landed would be able to understand. And so that year, Rafi, Meir, and I went to a nearby neighborhood to film Hasidic men inspecting the qualities of these branches and the esrog. And we captured some truly beautiful shots. But what was interesting about that experience is that afterwards, as I tried to piece it all together into some sort of video, I wasn't really satisfied with just repeating the talking points that I heard growing up about what the importance of the lulav and esrog were. I wanted to say something else. I wanted to go a level deeper. And so as I started digging, I found this scientific paper which once again would change the course of my life. The paper is called The Search for the Authentic Citron, a historic and genetic analysis. It described the historic way that people would inspect the quality of these fruits and how today scientists were using DNA analysis in order to do that. I will never forget that feeling of reading that paper late at night and realizing, oh my God, there is a whole world out there where you can relate to your Jewishness in a deep and meaningful way that is through a historic and cultural perspective, where you can get the thrill that Talmud provides without getting bogged down with the minutia of all the rules. In fact, if you look at one of the earliest videos that I posted on this channel, you'll see that video about my experience in the esrog market, which is based on that scientific paper. But the reason why this experience is so important to me went far beyond just the esrog, because it made something really clear to me, which had been building up in the background for years at that point. I realized that my family had survived so much persecution, whether it was the Khmelnytsky massacre or the Tsarist regime, the Nazi invasion, or Soviet repression, only to arrive in America and establish a new life for themselves. And it was during this chapter that I felt this intense dissonance between the two parts of myself, only to be taught that I needed to disown an entire part of my own existence and keep it hidden inside of the Beis Hakisei. And as a result, I had never felt farther from my own heritage. And so what this experience taught me was that Jewishness did not belong to a specific person, like my 11th grade rabbi, but rather to every Jew, myself included. My family didn't survive all of that persecution just to reach this point where it would be taken away from me by some asshole who gave me terrible advice at a critical stage in my life. I didn't know how just yet, but I resolved to make a change. I resolved to reconnect with my own Jewishness. And it was in that moment that the idea for this channel was born. I decided to use my love of history, of cinema, and storytelling to reconnect with what it meant to be Jewish on my own terms. And this would bring me to some of the most important moments in my experience of Jewishness, which in hindsight have become my Netziv moment, or more accurately, moments. When I was in Yeshiva, my routine consisted of coffee, prayer, Talmud, and bagels on repeat. But when I was around 20 years old, I decided to ask a very simple question, which was, what is the historical background to all of these things? And I decided to start with bagels. The truth is, I had no idea what the history of bagels were and why they were considered to be Jewish. And it turns out that there is a lot of history behind bagels, since they were brought to America by Jewish immigrants. And this opened the door for me to ask a much more fundamental question, which is, when did the first Jews arrive to America? Growing up, we were taught about the Great Wave, this generation of 2 million Jews who arrived from the Russian Empire to America, many of whom lived on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Although this generation was painted in a very negative light, since many of them did not continue to be Orthodox. Instead, growing up, I was taught that the true start of Jewishness in America was actually in the 1940s, when Holocaust refugees came to America and basically transplanted their Orthodox institutions in America, including the yeshivas that I went to. But it turns out that this view of history isn't really accurate, since there were Jews in America since almost the beginning, back in 1654, when the first Jews arrived into New York, back when it was still called New Amsterdam. What's more is that the challenges that that first generation overcame would actually set a precedent which every single Jewish person in America would benefit from. And the descendants of those first Jews would go on to have an influence on the founding fathers, which allows us to have the ability to openly express our Jewishness in America today. And so the fact that I didn't know any of this after 2 decades of Jewish education deeply bothered me. And after my experience with the esrog market, I decided to return to the story with a much deeper interest. I wanted to not just get to know their stories better, but to retrace their footsteps, to almost relive their lives, to inculcate their story into the core of who I am. I realized that there was something very unique about that first generation of Jews who arrived into New Amsterdam, and that is that they didn't feel any pressure to conform to an idea of Jewishness, which their counterparts in the old world definitely experienced. And so this story ended up becoming a model for me about what Yiddishkeit in America actually means. This idea of integrating one's Jewishness without feeling any sense of repression. Or in other words, studying Jewish American history allowed me to embrace my own Jewishness while slowly letting the Beis Hakisei Boy out of the bathroom. And the more I learned, the more I realized that this struggle of being between two worlds, the tension between Yaakov and Esav, wasn't unique to me at all. In fact, not only is it truly universal, but it's captured in many Jewish stories. In the film Hester Street, we meet a woman named Gittel, who is an immigrant from the Russian Empire to America in the 1890s. And she finds herself between two worlds, where on one side is her husband Jake, who completely embraces modernity and rejects his Jewishness, while on the other side is her boarder, Mr. Bernstein, who tries to maintain his Jewishness by still studying Torah and praying. And by the end, Gittel finds a way to integrate these two worlds, where she still finds a way to maintain her Jewishness, like Bernstein, but still adapts to her new surroundings in America. Although Gittel isn't a Beis Hakisei girl per se, it's this story of navigating two worlds and finding a way to integrate them in a way that made sense in her life is something that perfectly describes my experience. As a result, this has become my favorite movie, which I've seen over 20 times at this point, because it captures an experience that is so close to my own. As I continued to explore, I noticed that there were many other examples of Beis Hakisei boys and girls, some of which we already mentioned. But what I noticed is that in almost all of these stories, the end is about integration of the tradition and modernity as opposed to a rejection of either side. For example, in the story of The Chosen, Danny ends up leaving his father's house and pursuing a career in psychology, but he doesn't truly reject his father. Instead, he integrates the experience he had growing up as the son of a Hasidic rabbi into the man that he's trying to become.
Become a psychologist already. But you see, now I am not afraid. I have no fear because my Daniel is a tzaddik. He's a righteous man. And the world needs a righteous man.
Another story about a Beis Hakisei girl called Loving Leah, which is this Hallmark movie, which I've also seen about like 5 or 6 times at this point. And I think many people would argue that it's cheesy, but I think it also helps illustrate this idea. In that movie, she describes how she got married as a young girl at 18 without much input from her, because that was what her parents expected her to do. At the start of the movie, when Leah's husband passes away, she realizes that this is an opportunity for her to leave her own Beis Hakisei, to channel her desires for what she actually wants to achieve with her life, which in the case of the story was to go to college.
I got other plans, Essie. I don't like that look. What are you digging? Please, man. I've got my interview this afternoon. How are you going to tell Mama? Winging this would not be advised. I'm not moving back in with Mama.
Throughout this movie, we see that Leah is like Yoel David, who we started with, Danny Saunders, Esty from Disobedience, as well as myself, where she also has this secret life, where we see how she sneaks away to go watch movies which are forbidden. And when her mother finds out about the fact that she wants to leave the Beis Hakisei, her response, much like my 11th grade rabbi, is to completely repress that side of her.
You're living in a fantasy world. Marriage is not like those movies you're always sneaking off to see. The answers you seek are not to be found in a movie theater or a college campus. You have got to erase this Meshuggah dream from your head.
I can't.
What's also really interesting is that we can see this theme of being between two worlds in this film as well. And just like the theme of Yaakov and Esav, it's represented here in this movie with two brothers. The first brother, the rabbi, which Leah was married to, represents the good side, while the other brother, the secular doctor who Leah ends up with, represents evil.
Leia, you come from two completely different worlds. You are not right for each other.
You don't know him.
No, but I know you. You don't hold the same values as him. Where is his love of God, huh? He jokes. He puts vanity. He puts a gym before God.
To Leia, who's been hiding in the Beis Hakisei this whole time, this is an opportunity for her to leave her mother's house and to explore the world and herself and try to integrate those two things together to find the whole version of who she is without having to reject an entire half of her existence.
You're becoming so assimilated that God won't know who you are. I can't find you.
It's still me. I'm still observant.
To me, this moment says it all. It's not about becoming someone new, but rather becoming the truest version of oneself, which is something that, at this point of the story, Leia's mother can't understand. This idea also shows up in another Beis Hakisei Boy story, which is the 1980 retelling of The Jazz Singer with Neil Diamond. That story is about a man named Yassel Rabinovich who lives with his wife and his father on the Lower East Side and wants to write pop songs and perform for a general audience and not just for the congregation in the synagogue. But his father is unable to understand that, which causes Yassel to have to hide this part of himself from his father and to some extent from his wife.
I have been sneaking around and doing these kind of shows now for a long time. We need the extra money. What is so terrible?
Yeah, if it's not so terrible, why all the sneaking around?
Because you think it's terrible.
And after some success, Yassel moves to LA, where he changes his name to Jess Robin. He ends up marrying a non-Jewish woman who his father totally rejects and considers Yassel dead to him. There's this really important moment in the film where he faces some defeat and he's considering moving back to New York. And he's discussing these two identities that he has with the woman who will eventually become his wife.
I really am a cantor. I come from a family of cantors. 5 generations. A cantor Rabinovich.
So now suddenly there's a Jess Robin.
There's always been a Jess Robin.
This is a super crucial moment in the film because it explains to us that Yassel isn't simply just rejecting his father and tradition, but rather the whole time there were two people inside of him. There was Yassel and Jess, Yaakov and Esav. And even though his father didn't let Jess exist, that doesn't mean that that part just went away. And so at this point of the story, he wants to let that part of him out and develop.
Ever since I was a kid, you know, the songs, they go through your head. I don't know, I guess I came out here to see if they were any good. See if I'm any good.
By the end of the story, Jess and his father are able to reconcile when Jess goes back to the synagogue in order to perform the Kol Nidre service on Yom Kippur Eve, and his father is able to attend one of his shows sitting next to his new wife. And this is in stark contrast to the Yiddish film Overture to Glory, where in that retelling, Yoel David also returns to his hometown on Yom Kippur Eve and performs Kol Nidre, having left the secular world of the opera behind him. But at the end of that story, he drops dead from a broken heart. The key distinction between these retellings is that in the mind of the writer of Overture to Glory or My 11th Grade Rabbi, there is no integration. It's just a binary choice. And therefore it pays to stick to one side, since by making the wrong decision, it could prove to be fatal. However, in the minds of writers of other stories like Hester Street and The Chosen and Disobedience and Loving Leia and The Jazz Singer, there is a possibility for integration, to combine those two identities into something whole, where the two sides, Yaakov and Esav, don't have to be at odds with each other, but can be on the same team. In fact, the author of the original Jazz Singer, Samson Raphaelson, made this extremely clear in his original story. How could the old cantor, or for that matter Jakey himself, understand that instead of being sinful and self-indulgent, loose and lazy, this grave-eyed boy with the ways of the street was sincerely carrying on the tradition of plaintive religious melody of his forefathers, carrying on that tragic tradition disguised ironically with the trappings of Broadway. This quote makes something extremely clear, that at the heart of all Beis Hakisei Boy stories is the idea that the part that had to remain hidden was actually not at odds with tradition at all, but was rather trying to achieve the same thing, to fulfill one's potential. And it turns out that it was the repression that caused the rift, not modernity. As I internalized this message, I began to realize that I want to step out of my own Beis Hakisei and to be able to spread that message with others. And so this led to the start of our Yiddish Kino Club, where we explored many of the movies we mentioned in this video, as well as exploring stories from Jewish American history. It's the stories of the first Jews in America that embody this idea of integration, of being thoroughly American while still holding a distinct Jewish identity, which is something that all of us benefit from, whether we realize it or not. In fact, a few years ago, my friend Meir and I went to record another story, this time about the first Jews in America and their struggle to find their identity and a foothold in this new land, particularly focusing on the story of one man named Usher Levy, who became the first Jewish citizen of America. There was this one moment where we went to the American Jewish Historical Society in Manhattan to look at these documents from the 1680s, which are part of Usher Levy's estate. It's very hard to describe the feeling that I had looking, touching, smelling a piece of Jewish American history that is hundreds of years old. The truth is that experience was surreal, that even now, 2 years later, I still haven't fully processed that experience, which is why I haven't been able to turn that into a video just yet. But it was these kinds of moments, whether it was looking at Usher Levy's estate documents or going to Washington, D.C. to look at historic Haggadahs that were also hundreds of years old, or going to Newport in Rhode Island this past summer to hear the reading of Washington's letter to the Jews there in 1790, as well as other experiences which I have covered, like praying over the grave of Rabbi Gershom Mendes Seixas, who was the rabbi of the American Revolution, as well as reciting one of Emma Lazarus's own poems over her grave, which I covered in a video this past summer. During these moments, I had this feeling like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. Those moments, as we say in Hebrew, felt like my tafkid, my purpose, to take these extremely important and complex moments in Jewish American history and to turn it into something that felt alive and vibrant and accessible. And so you could see the chain of events, from the throwaway line from my rabbi in 7th grade, to the Esrog market, to the Jewish Film Club, to all the other videos on this channel, and to the videos which I haven't made yet. What I want to say now feels really scary, but here goes. In those moments, I felt something. I felt a flash of inspiration that this is something I want to build my life on. And in other words, what I'm trying to say is that I've been blessed, that I've been given Netziv moments. To end this video, I want to take you to a very special place in Brooklyn. Here, inside Greenwood Cemetery, on the top of this hill, in addition to the incredible view, is a small obelisk with a slit at its base with the inscription, "Here lies the secrets of the visitors of Greenwood Cemetery."
For a very long time, I've been holding on to a secret, that I like movies and girls, that I like to go to the gym and listen to pop music. All of which was not just not allowed, but I had to pretend that that part of me wasn't even there. But now, not only am I proud of all of that, it's by watching movies about other Beis Hakisei boys and girls that I find comfort. And it's by making videos that go on the internet that makes me feel closer to my Jewishness. And so now, after all these years, I feel ready to lay that secret to rest. If you feel like you're a Beis Hakisei boy or girl, then hopefully by hearing my story, you will feel less alone and your secrets will feel less heavy. I don't want to pretend like I have all the answers or that I'm perfectly integrated, because I'm not. I feel like I'm just at the beginning of this journey. But one thing that I do know is that when it comes to my internal Esav, he is not my enemy. And not only can Yaakov and Esav be friends, but they're actually
the same person. And so I want to thank you for listening to my story and being a part of my journey and letting me be a small part of yours. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.